Greetings. I just want to welcome the Facebook family. This is Dr. Kamau Kokayi here, the Multidimensional Healing Collective. And perhaps some of you all were just on my radio program, Quantum Wellness, with Dr. Andrew Marino. And we were talking about looking at the reality of where we're at right now with respect to addressing the needs of human beings in terms of how we address ourselves, how we deal with our biology, what's real, what's scientific, what's worthy of study. And we both come to the same conclusion that things have kind of gone left with respect to, how we're actually proceeding to move forward in what we're calling a reductionistic paradigm, right? So my guest, Dr. Andrew Marino, has been is the premier researcher on looking at low-level electromagnetic fields, the effect of on human biology, has done more publishing in that area, who's somebody whose work greatly has influenced my career and the path that I chose. And, as I said on the radio program, I was so happy to discover that he was still here lecturing in the same way that I discovered that my thesis advisor is still around, who went on to set up a laboratory of human potential in Phoenix. And we've had conversations. But Dr. Marino, welcome to our Facebook page. And let's just pick up the conversation because you are using your scholarship to really document what happened. And why don't you talk a little bit about that and where you feel that we're at this point?
Well, I spent 50 years working full-time in biomedical research. After I got my degree in physics, I stayed with a seminal line of research that began with Robert Becker, who asked the simple question about living systems. How do they work? How does bone heal? How is it bone can heal? The injury is sensed, bone grows, bone is laid down. Too much bone is laid down, it's remodeled. And when you go back and look histologically, you can't find anything that's different than normal. It's a perfect replica. It actually regenerated. He started asking questions about how that's controlled. It can't be biochemistry. Biochemistry is involved, but biochemistry isn't a control system. What turns it on and off? Then he expanded his interest to regeneration. Why is it we can cut off a limb of a salamander and it grows a new limb? A frog, which is one step up phylogenetically, you cut off a frog's leg and you wind up with a frog with a stump. Why did the ability to regenerate tissue stop? He began a series of studies in the early 60s, decided that electromagnetic energy was key. He wanted a physicist to help him. We did a deal with my mentor. I was a first-year graduate student. I was hired into his lab, and I began performing experiments to help put a scientific foundation under his theories. He was a very, very famous guy in the 60s. His a series of 7 or 8 papers he published in the most prestigious scientific journals in the world.
This is
Science,
Dr. Robert
Nature,
Becker, right?
Dr. Robert Becker made great progress. And we started using electrical energy to growing bone. And some of his colleagues immediately formed a company and started getting FDA approval and selling devices using electrical energy to grow bone. He thought
Right,
that was wrong, that we ought to study side effects first. Make
right,
sure that's what a physician do no harm to find
right.
out the rule. And I started then, he gave me the responsibility for doing studies to see if it did any harm. So I simulated the electromagnetic energy environment in the laboratory and exposed animals. and got adverse effects. Dr. Becker sent that result to power companies and the government. And the government ignored us, and the power companies said, go to hell. You don't know what you're talking about.
Wow.
That
Wow.
was no way to talk to me. And my life went off in that direction for the next 50 years, fueled in that direction. Dr. Becker got terminated at the end of the 70s by the National Academy of Sciences and its role in interfering with VA research. But I had the greatest job in the world at the time, and the lab closed, so I found a medical school in Louisiana, and I got the best job in the world that existed at that time, and held it from 1981 to 2014, all following that line of showing that electromagnetic energy was biologically active, that it was important, that it produced effects in animals, and then understanding how the laws of physics could permit it, because the guys from industry were hired to say it was impossible. I showed it was possible. And then I got into human studies. And then I did the final definitive experiment a month before I retired in 2014. That's the way the whole thing went.
Right. So here we are. And as I explained on the radio program, because human beings are suffering in general from a consciousness deficit disorder, where the focus becomes more of what an individual wants to do or has the power to do, even though it might harm or have a negative impact on the environment or on other human beings, because they have the wherewithal to do it, they just go ahead and do it. So, and we see that in so many areas of human, of human life, but clearly in the medical field, when you go back and you know, as you were saying that some of that initial research is looking at why salamander can regenerate and why human beings can't regenerate, right? Um, it becomes very interesting in terms of the application for these electromagnetic fields and what to do with them, right? So the fact that all of that research was cut off, at least looking at the harmful effects of electromagnetic fields, right? In terms of the benefits, has anything continued, in your mind as worthy of scientific consideration?
Listen, what got cut off is not just research into harmful effects. Every time I published an article showing harmful effect, the industry went out and hired somebody at Battelle Northwest or one of these research for hire places, and they rigged an experiment to show that I was wrong. And I have the whole story because I got Vice President Mondale told the Department of Energy to send me the information I wanted, and I saw all of the correspondence that went back and forth, rigging the experiments against me. It's just not. It's just not harmful results that are rigged by industry. Let me make it clear to you. It's all studies involving electromagnetic energy, the pursuit of studying cybernetic systems in the body, the idea of studying the role of electromagnetic energy, with the exception of the well understood Huxley model of nerve flow, which we have known since 1956. With that exception, no studies are funded by the government. The rule is we shall not fund those studies because they are non-reductionistic. So it's all studies involving electromagnetic energy, not just the bad part, anything at all, the good part.
So let's just um, let's just break that down a bit for people because we're saying anything that's non-reductionistic, right? So, in other words, that's saying that unless it's just a carefully controlled, I would say, left brain way of looking at something where, it's a logical pattern as opposed to something that's more open-ended and just exploring, well, what does this
No,
mean?
no, no.
And
I certainly don't mean to imply that. Everything I did was rigorously scientific. It
no,
was
I get that.
okay. Everything was a controlled study. The question is, what kind of studies are you going to do? Are you
Right.
going? Uh, you can do a reductionistic study and study biochemistry, or you can do a non-reductionistic study and study or control. What one is focused on mechanisms, the other is focused on explaining how something that we observe takes place and documenting theories about how it can take place, but not based on biochemical explanations, based on cybernetic explanations. It's a different approach to biology.
I understand. You're right. That is a different approach. So within that, I saw that part of one of the positions or work that you've done is in cybernetics, right? And how much progress were you able to make before like a door was closed?
Well, I stayed on a narrow course of making the point that the human body detected electromagnetic fields, such as ones come from power lines, and human body detected electromagnetic energy that comes from cell phones. I proved it with a controlled study, mathematical rigor, P less than oh 0.05, and all on human beings,
Right,
all published in journals. That's
right.
as far as I could take it. Beyond that, it's time for the next guy to step in. My career is over.
Well, let me ask you, given that the potential harmful effects that that these low-level electromagnetic fields in general can have, are you aware of any technologies that, from your perspective, are worthwhile for people to invest in relative to protecting themselves from smart meters and things of that nature?
Now look. Electromagnetic energy, man-made electromagnetic energy, is a stressor. It's a biological stressor. uh, uh, you don't have to be much of a physician, or you don't have to be skilled in the knowledge of Hans Selye's work to understand that stress taxes the body's adaptive system and increases the rate of disease. Uh, uh, so the way to deal with it is to minimize stress. Some people are exposed to electromagnetic energy. If they're going to do that because they just and they're not going to separate and give up their cell phone, the only rational strategy is to minimize stressors in other area of their life, because cell phones are here forever. They're never going to go away, and they're never going to get explained and understood, because research to do that can't be done. It's the companies certainly aren't going to do it, and the government certainly isn't going to do it. So the response is be prudent, minimize your exposure to stressors so that you're removing taxes on your adaptive capacity, and you'll live longer and be healthier.
So what I tell folks there, as medicine has progressed and gone through different stages within the alternative medical field, you have something called functional medicine, where there's all kind of testing where they can really document the level of oxidative stress on the body, the level of chronic inflammation, and begin to use things that counter that. Now, what I would say is that um, and we won't get into particular therapies and things, but given that we're dealing with things that are of an energetic or electromagnetic nature, wouldn't it be possible then to use other types of things that generate fields that can somehow neutralize that or counter that?
Look, I've two things uh, uh, um, to say. First, you've fallen into a serious trap in the use of a reductionistic term, oxidative stress. I certainly wouldn't use that term at all. You're
Okay.
way down to you're patting the biochemists from the top of their head. Don't do that. I'm talking about biological stress, hand cellular stress, the
Okay.
HPA axis, a completely different thing.
Okay.
The second thing I'd say is that um, there are no other if we understand and agree. You see, the holistic approach that you're advocating and following is terrific. The problem is it's the teeniest part of present day medicine. It has no, in medical schools I've seen, almost zero standing. That's from my personal observations. It's very small. We're not teaching medical students about that. We're just not doing it. Uh, so it's hard to make progress in the area that you're functioning, given those limitations. Uh,
So let me frame it another way, right? Because in the study of biology, we start off with there's the basic cell. So you have the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and the cell wall, but the very thing that's left out of that is the life energy itself. It's the energy that actually animates the cell, right?
It,
Um,
that's not right. That that that's
oh,
that,
okay,
there's a it's a living organism. Now the
right.
energy that animates the cell, that sort of makes it seem like there's something there that's real. Energy is not real. Energy is an invention of a physicist. He invented it as a word for mathematically describing the driving force of natural processes. It's not a real thing. So you got to be, you see, you can get troubled
So what's more real? Is it the energetic field or the matter?
uh,
Which is actually more real then, if we're going to talk in those terms?
what's real is that a cell is a living system. So it's a system all by itself, devoid from the laws of it's got to obey the laws of physics. If you pass electricity to it, it's got the electricity, it can be measured such and such. It's got to obey the laws of physics, but the laws of physics can't explain it. So
So,
if
but right, but this
you
is what I'm getting back to, and what Becker, the question was, well, what makes the bone actually heal? What causes the bone to unite, to heal itself? So, in other words, what is actually giving life to the cell?
he
What
did
is
not
actually causing all those processes? If we're
he
not
did
going to call it energy, what would you want to call it?
he did not pose the questions and the issues that way. He started with a hypothesis that the healing was controlled by a growth system, and he wanted to understand the nature of the growth system, and the nature of the growth system was electromagnetic. That's the technically correct language. If
Okay.
you can easily get
So then going back to the cell, what would we say is the nature of what keeps the cell going? Is it just a series of thousands of chemical reactions every second, or is there something to actually look at that's underneath that that actually allows the cell to be alive, so to speak?
if I understood the question, what makes the cell do things? The cell is processing information from the nerves, it's receiving signals, it's sending signals to the brain, it's doing all of this, and it's consuming energy. Where is it getting the energy from? From food, from the process that you learned when you did the Krebs cycle when you were a freshman in medical school. That's where it gets the energy, chemical energy. Chemical energy is that it drives the system, does not control the system. That's what Becker asked about. Two separate things.
Right. That is, I appreciate the perspective, but I guess I have a slightly different
Well,
understanding of that. And in part, it's informed by other cultural systems or so when we like in Chinese medicine, if we start talking about qi or prana, right? When I, as a martial artist, could see different things done that defied a material understanding of what was happening, right? Then, I mean, so we called it chi when someone is able to direct energy in a particular way, and where it's actually palpable. And as an extension of that, even in something called Reiki, pranic healing, Qigong, where energy is actually directed, right? Um, and even in terms of our thoughts is I think when we did the radio interview, I mentioned that I had patients that had, when they were told they had AIDS, they died within 2 or 3 days. Their bodies just shut down. So I'm just suggesting there's something else that's underneath all the chemical reactions that are taking place that allow the cell to function. So, and I'm so clearly this is not in a reductionistic kind of model and stuff.
No,
You know what I'm
no.
saying? Right. But I'm just like, what do we call that?
Um, uh, call it what Dr. Becker called it, a cybernetic model. Look, you're using we're talking about terms. These terms are coming out, and they're not carefully defined. They have meaning to me, and they're going to have meaning to your guests. But no two guests probably going to have the same understanding of the terms. So there can be some confusion
It's
that creeps in.
confusing, right?
You use the term cultural systems. Now, Dr. Becker was a true scientist. He had a theory that cybernetics was important, and he saw acupuncture, a classic a cultural system. He saw it as interesting and worth inquiring into using empirical methods. If you do not inquire into something using objective empirical methods, then you're nowhere. You're wasting your time, and it's going to go away when you die. You'll leave nothing. Uh, he inquired into acupuncture. I think I have elsewhere told the story of how he did it and why he did it, and which led to our studies of it. Uh, Dr. Becker and I have written 6 or 7, plus 2 or 3 other people in our lab, 6 or 7 papers about acupuncture as a providing evidence that there's a basis, a scientific basis, according to Western concepts of science, not Eastern, Western, because
Right.
we only follow Western here.
Okay.
And those articles are published in journals and are the most cited studies today for anybody who's studying acupuncture. So I understand exactly what that means, what a cultural system, having respect for it is, but not for every cultural system. Some cultural systems have been sucked out of somebody's thumb. I mean, it doesn't merit the studies that, for example, Becker and I did.
Right. So here's the thing that happens, right? Um, once as a human being or as a practitioner, once you move past just the idea of biochemistry, right? Once you dip into this thing called the energy, the life force, the chi, or whatever, right? Then one is very subjective, and two, your results will vary depending on your ability to harness that energy as well as the patient's reaction to it. Right. And I say that because we're not talking about double-blind controlled studies. We're talking about one-to-one empirical studies that well, I don't want to call it a study, but clinical interactions between
Oh,
a patient, because one acupuncturist can get a totally different result than a different one, because it has to do with their read on that particular energetic system and what's needed. And there are other systems that we're not even talking about acupuncture, but there are other ways to manipulate the biological energy that go beyond just electromagnetic fields. Now, I'm saying that I know you would shake your head. It's okay. It's okay. But um, this isn't something that's necessarily going to be studied in a particular. You can study from the vantage point, and this has actually been done. Lynn McTaggart, I believe her name is, when they've looked at just having people meditate and focus, meaning intention, in a particular area and they're able to document that something actually changed. So it's one thing to actually have a methodology where you can actually measure the changes in the electromagnetic energy. But there are other areas where you can't, well, science is able to do that more, but that's a whole nother conversation. But you can't really measure, well, how are these changes being affected? It's different, but go ahead,
Well,
I'll let you speak.
look, 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 look. Uh, how are these changes being affected? Assumes that there were changes due to the intervention. That's dubious because you've got no clinical evidence, you've got no empirical evidence. You just got an observation.
You
Uh,
have an observation that the patient's symptoms and signs changed. If not, what would spontaneous remission mean?
uh, um, the spontaneous emission could have occurred
Remission.
if he never even knew a guy named Kamau, and he spent his time watching the Brooklyn, the New York Mets play baseball, and he got excited, and that's where it came from. You got no basis for linking the two. Look. Let me go back to the core point here. Uh, um, uh, using words using words that are not carefully defined in an explanation is you're just cruising for a bruising. You're just going to have problems. Cultural systems now, and paying respect to cultural systems in anything more than the fact that they've hung around for a long time and there may be something important. But there's no scientific evidence as that term is understood by Western science. And that's the only language, the only science I can speak. So what you mean by cultural
I
system?
understand that, but what's happened, people will do studies that are more empirical studies, meaning they're outcome studies. Outcome, you applied a set of variables, you did this, and then there's an outcome that happens.
That's
Now,
not the way.
if you
That's not
look
the
at
way.
outcomes, I understand it is not the kind of double-blind control study, but in my world, even that doesn't make sense because you're actually trying to eliminate the very thing that is so fundamental to people, which is consciousness and intention. You
Here's the
try to
thing.
eliminate anybody that you try to eliminate that.
Yeah, the placebo effect is real. And a drug I developed for osteoarthritis and it failed in an FDA study was because of the placebo effect. I know more than anybody that's ever lost money invested in an FDA drug what a placebo effect is, and it is real.
But what
Nobody
is it though? But what's actually happening?
nobody knows. It's never been studied. That's where it ends. Period. You got to recognize that. You also misuse the term empirical observations. Every observation I made was controlled empirical observation. There's no other kind of observation. There's no theoretical observation.
There's an uncontrolled there's an uncontrolled
It's
there are no controls with it, right?
well, in that case, you are not justified in concluding a cause and effect relationship. In a
Well,
controlled empirical
yeah.
observation, you can.
So look at it this way. If somebody comes in to my office, right? I give you an example. I'm at an event and somebody is having difficulty breathing. They're clearly having an asthma attack. They don't have their inhaler, right? I happen to have a magnet, right? Which using a Korean hand acupuncture point, I put it right on the center of their chest. But the center of their chest happens to be on my middle finger. I put it right there, right? And the asthma attack, it breaks like within a minute or two, right? Now, I'm not going to try and I'm using that cultural system that was developed within that framework, right? So why does one culture tap into electromagnetic field energy, right? And another culture really taps into um, matter or material energy, right? Different cultures, depending on how you are in the world and how you interact with nature, it's going to change your focus and how you interact with nature, right? So one culture will focus on something else, a relationship that in another culture may not even be perceived or it seems magical or whatever, right? So,
no, no, no. The cultural system of acupuncture goes back 2,000 years, and the word electromagnetic is not even invented. They weren't doing anything about electromagnetic. They had an observational pattern. They could do human experimentation without following federal rules that I had to follow. And they came to a conclusion that acupuncture works. There's such a thing as meridians, and there are points, and and if you put a needle here and twist there, the symptoms are going to go away.
I,
It was all up.
I'm sure some of it is trial and error, but in other cultures where someone goes into the forest, right, and trying to come up with a particular plant medicine that's going to help somebody, right? And they literally are having a conversation, right, with um they're sharing in the consciousness or energy field of a plant and are able to tap into the fact that this plant might be useful. In your mind, I can tell by your face that's total nonsense. And that's
It's
not,
it's like back penicillin. You take the mold and you put it on, and the infection goes away. It's nothing to do with electric energy. It has to do with
yeah.
biochemistry. Simple, simple, simple.
I understand, but it's like it's tapping into the field of information and knowledge of that that allows you to do that. But this is my point at the very beginning. Once you cross a certain line, then we start tapping into other things that don't necessarily adhere to the rules of the scientific method. Science itself means to know, and they're just different ways to know that are outside of what we've been taught within an allopathic or Western medical framework.
What does
So,
no mean? What does no mean?
to know,
What does it mean in this context? If you
well,
know something.
science is a way, it gives you a way to know things.
No, I'm not talking about science. I'm talking about this other system you're talking about. I know what knowing in science means. What about knowing?
So, when somebody puts their hand in Chinese medicine and they put their hands on pulses, right? And they're feeling these pulses relate to different energetic systems in the body. And they can arrive at an understanding of what is off or what needs to be addressed in the body. That is one way of knowing. That is one way of interfacing with that system,
There's
right?
no evidence that system exists. How can
That's not true. But leaving that, if you walk into a room, and I'm sure you've had this, if you walk into a room, and again, everybody has a the heart has a bioenergetic field. And it does. But if you walk into a room and you sense that, wait, something is not right here, I don't need to be here, and you have a particular feeling about that space and you leave, the question is that is just something that you're conjuring up in your brain, or did you actually interface with another field of energy that wasn't like, you're like, nah, that doesn't work.
or did you happen to see a gun sticking out of the pocket of the guy in front of you, made you feel
That
uncomfortable?
would be a direct observation, but I'm saying that people function on other levels beside just their five senses, right?
That's a great theory. There's no evidence for it, but it's a great theory.
I'll send you some stuff that actually that does document that. But that's for another lifetime, let's say.
We're
That's
not going to get it settled today, are we?
huh?
We're not
No.
going to get it settled today.
So, but you know what? We're going to end here, but I totally appreciate all the work that you've done and the foundation that you're laying and the information that you're going to share. And like yourself, I do hope that the reductionist model, that we move past that and we begin to look at other ways of looking at systems, right, and approaching it. And your observation about the fact that research money isn't given to, I mean, I've had even a grant turned down and stuff, but it was definitely something that was not going to fly within a pharmaceutical driven, model. So, and do hang around for at least another 10 years to see what happens as we move through this era. And I'm going to do the same myself, God
Good.
willing. Um, Thank you so much for taking time out of your day, Dr. Marino. Okay. All right, multi-DHC family, share your comments and, look forward to interacting with you more. Take care.